As you prepare to take the final step in proofreading Essay 1, I wanted to just kind of review with you some of the top errors that I notice in student writing and in other writing as well. This is not a complete list of every grammar rule there is. I don't think that's necessary. These are just the most common grammar mistakes that I typically see when I grade papers. When you're writing, you can write in first person, which is the I or we voice, second person, the you voice, or third person, the he, she, they, him, her, who, whom, them voice. You want to be sure you pick one governing voice and stick with it throughout your paper. Here's an example of a shift. I stopped at the scene of a car wreck and it was awful. You saw people covered in blood on the side of the road and you just wanted to help them all. Now, if you heard someone say that in conversation, it's not going to jump out at you as a mistake because this is how we speak. But in writing, you will notice that it switches from the I voice to the you voice, from first person to second person. So the better way to write this would be, I stopped at the scene of a car wreck and it was awful. I saw people covered in blood on the side of the road and I just wanted to help them all. Shifts in tense are another issue that I notice in student writing, and I will tell you that I struggle with this one too. You want to be consistent with your verb tense. Every paper must have a governing tense. The main two to be concerned with are present tense and past tense. There are other tenses, there are future tenses and perfect tenses, but really I think these are the main two. So if you're writing in present tense, it's as if the action is happening right now. You're recreating it in a way that it's happening in the moment. I am in my room. I have just finished doing my homework. So it's almost like you're telling something from the perspective of it happening right now. Past tense is looking backwards. So I was in my room. I had just finished my homework. It's as if you're retelling a story or event after it has happened. Either tense can work really well in most writing situations, but you just want to make sure you're not jumping back and forth between the two. All right, sentence fragments are something that I do notice quite a bit, and I think they sound more complicated than they are. In order to be complete, every sentence has to have a subject, which is who or what is doing the action, which is the verb. And I think the word subject can be confusing because you might think, oh, the subject of a sentence is what it's about. But that's not the case. The subject is always who or what is doing the action of the sentence. And the action is the verb. And a sentence has to also have a complete idea. A sentence that is lacking either a subject or a verb is broken or fragmented. That's where the name comes about. So it's important to remember that ing verbs are not complete by themselves. So here's an example of a fragment. I have always loved animals. That's a perfect sentence. Subject I, verb have. But the second part is a fragment, beginning with my first kitten, Rainbow. There is no subject in that sentence, and there's not a complete verb. Beginning is a part of a verb, but it's not the entire verb. So you would just want to put these two together in one sentence. I've always loved animals, beginning with my first kitten, Rainbow. You could also revise it several other ways, but that's probably the simplest way to do it. Here's another one, hanging out and watching TV. We have hanging out and watching, which are not complete verbs, and we don't know who is hanging out and watching TV. So you could fix it very simply by adding a subject, we, and a verb, were, goes with the hanging and watching. We were hanging out and watching TV. Lindsay and her sister, Jenna. This sentence is all about the subject, but there is no verb. What were they doing? So it's a fragment also. Lindsay and her sister, Jenna, were driving to the mall. That fixes it. You just have to say what the verb is for that particular sentence. Lindsay and her sister Jenna are identical twins. Lindsay and her sister Jenna love going to the movies. All of those fix this sentence perfectly. Here's another look at how you could repair a sentence fragment. There's lots of ways to repair them. So here's my fragment. We were at the restaurant eating as a family. Eating as a family is a fragment because there's no subject and there's not a complete verb. Eating cannot stand by itself as a verb. So you could put it all in one sentence. We were at the restaurant eating as a family. You could break it into two sentences. We were at the restaurant. We were eating as a family. You could put the word because in there. We were at the restaurant because we were eating as a family. Or you could put a comma and in there. We were at the restaurant, comma, and we were eating as a family. Any of those will fix your fragment. Just make sure that it has a complete subject and a complete verb. All right, run-on sentences are something that can be really confusing to students and to lots of other people too. A run-on sentence is not just a long sentence. And I think a lot of times people think that, oh, it means it runs on and on and on and on. No, a run-on sentence is a very specific type of grammar mistake. There are two types, comma splice and fused sentence. A comma splice is when you have two full sentences, two complete ideas that could stand alone as sentences, but they are pushed together in one sentence with only a comma between them. If the two parts of the sentence, what comes before the comma and after the comma, could stand alone as complete sentences or independent clauses, then a comma is not strong enough to separate those two independent clauses. You need something more. A fused sentence is when you have two independent clauses or complete sentences, and they're pushed together in one sentence with no punctuation between them at all. You need to have something separating your independent clauses or complete sentences. So we'll look at some examples of this. We took a vacation to Hawaii. It was beautiful. Now you can see the problem is between the word Hawaii and it. We took a vacation to Hawaii could stand alone as a complete sentence. It was beautiful is a very short sentence, but it's a complete one. It is your subject, was is your verb. Now this looks better. We took a vacation to Hawaii, comma, it was beautiful, but this is a comma splice. So the first example here is a fused sentence, and the second is a comma splice. That comma is not strong enough to separate two independent clauses from each other in a sentence. So here's how you could fix it. We took a vacation to Hawaii, comma, and it was beautiful. You're putting the comma and the and in there. And is one of the coordinating conjunctions, also called fanboys. We're going to talk more about those in a moment. And it can go in there with a comma because what comes after the and is an independent clause or a complete sentence. We took a vacation to Hawaii, semicolon. It was beautiful. A semicolon is a perfect fix for a comma splice or fused sentence. Just that semicolon shows you this is all one sentence together, but these two ideas are separated by something a little stronger than a comma. You could also make it into two sentences. We took a vacation to Hawaii, period. It was beautiful. You could use a colon where the semicolon is, or you could add a subordinating element. A subordinating element is a big word that just basically means something that makes one idea less important than the other. So when we took a vacation to Hawaii, comma, it was beautiful. By putting that word when in there, it makes that first half of the sentence no longer a complete sentence or independent clause. When we took a vacation to Hawaii cannot stand alone. It needs something after it. So then the comma works. All right, let's talk a little bit more about commas. Commas can be really confusing because sometimes people will say, oh, commas are optional. And really, very rarely are commas optional. There are specific rules for commas, and I really enjoy teaching the comma because I think it's often overused or underused, and the rules are pretty clear. So here's an example of where commas can be optional and can totally change the meaning of a sentence. Still, comma, water was important to many primitive tribes, or still water was important to many primitive tribes. The word still takes on a completely different meaning in each of these sentences just because of the comma. So when you have an independent and dependent clause, there are specific rules for commas. Remember, an independent clause is simply a complete sentence. It's a part of a sentence, it's a complete idea, subject, verb, complete idea. So you can make it stand alone with a period as a sentence, or you can combine it into longer sentences and it becomes an independent clause. A dependent clause is a clause that has the subject and verb, but it can't stand by itself because it's not complete, or it has a subordinating element or something like that. So again, I mentioned these earlier. The fanboys are the 7 coordinating conjunctions. So for, and, nor, but, or, yet, or so. And when they are in a sentence, they make the two parts of it kind of equal. That's why it's called a coordinating conjunction. And so you use a comma with a coordinating conjunction as long as both halves of the sentence are independent and could stand alone. So for instance, I am very upset right now, comma, but tomorrow I'll feel better. I am very upset right now could stand alone as a sentence. Tomorrow I'll feel better could stand alone as a sentence. Both of those clauses have subject, verb, complete idea. So if you put the word but in there and combine them into one sentence, you do need the comma because both halves of that could stand alone. Here's another example. When you have a dependent clause first, followed by an independent clause, you put a comma after the dependent clause. This is also sometimes called an introductory phrase. Before you decide on a major, comma, you must meet with a counselor. So there's a comma there because the first half of that sentence cannot stand alone on its own. The second half can, so you put a comma after the first half or the introductory phrase. But if you flip them around, you must meet with a counselor before you decide on a major, then you don't need the comma because the independent clause comes first and the dependent clause comes second. So you don't put the comma if the independent clause comes first. Now we're going to talk about commas with nouns and modifiers. You know that nouns are persons, places, or things, and modifiers are adverbs or adjectives that add more information or modify nouns and verbs. Adjectives modify or add to nouns, tell you more about the nouns, and adverbs modify or add to verbs. When you have a list of 3 or more things in one sentence, you put commas between them. This is probably the first comma rule all of us ever learned in elementary school. Commas with a list of 3 or more things. They bought grapes, chips, hot dogs, and popcorn. Now the comma after the word hot dogs is actually called the Oxford comma. You may have heard that term. And that's just a comma before an and when you have a list of 3 or more things or items. The Oxford comma is actually optional. It's kind of a personal choice. I love an Oxford comma. Some people really don't, but you can choose whether you put the comma before the and or not when it's a list. This is only applying to a list of 3 or more things, items, etc. If you only have 2 things on your list, they bought grapes and popcorn, no comma is needed. The commas go in there when there are 3 or more. She carried beautiful red roses. So you do not need a comma between the words beautiful and red, which are modifiers. They're both modifying the noun roses, telling you more about the kind of roses she carried. And you would only put a comma there if you could insert the word and it would make sense. So she carried beautiful and red roses does not make sense. So you do not need a comma. However, she carried sweet, fragrant red roses. She carried sweet and fragrant red roses. Sounds good. So you would put the comma between sweet and fragrant. You will also use commas around information that is not essential to the sentence. Sometimes this is called an aside or words that interrupt the flow of the sentence. I've heard it called scoopable information. But for instance, you understand, of course, that this class is optional. The sentence would still make sense without the of course. You understand that this class is optional. So you put the commas around of course to show it's just kind of a little extra added aside or added information that's not necessary for meaning. Jack Jones, my neighbor, is very friendly. And so you put the commas around my neighbor because you don't need that to make the sentence make sense. Jack Jones is very friendly works just fine by itself. So here is your final thought about grammar and grammar in essays. Grammar is a means to an end, not an end in itself. That quote is from Kitty Chen Dean. She is the author of many textbooks about writing and essays, and I really admire her work. And what I love about this quote is it really does capture the important things about grammar. I don't show you all of those grammar rules because I expect you to be able to identify and give the definition for a comma splice as much as I want you to not write with comma splices. It doesn't matter to me if you have all of the comma rules memorized or not, as long as you use commas correctly. So I show you this grammar not just to show you grammar, but hopefully improve your writing. Thanks.